And if you are a UAC member, please come up here, if you would be so kind. You're going to sit back there, or you can sit around if you like, as the case may be.
Is it hot? Hello, hello. Testing, testing. I may need to sit, which is probably just as well. No, that would not work. Good afternoon. I guess we're testing out some new technology here as well. So, if you don't mind bearing with me, I will hold this microphone in an awkward manner. My name's Ed Shikata. I'm the Assistant City Manager, also the General Manager of the Utilities Department. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this special workshop of our Utility Advisory Commission. Now, as it is, this is really an interactive workshop, and the UAC, though, does provide the umbrella as well as clearly the leadership that has helped both organize and follow up on the discussion we'll have this evening. We do, as a public meeting, as a meeting of the Utility Advisory Commission, need to go through a few of our Brown Act requirements. We'll do a calling of the roll, as well as we will have, let's see if we've got it on here, the opportunity for the public to speak. And actually, I've got an old version of the agenda. So do you happen to have one that has the opportunity for public speakers? No? All right. So in any case, maybe we can grab another copy. But so let me just provide a little bit of framing, if you don't mind, and then we'll go through our meeting logistics. So first off, oh, here we go. All right. Okay, so we'll do our roll call, and so why don't I take care of that, if you don't mind, and as I call your name, utility commissioners can raise your hands. Our chair, Mike Danaher. Oh, there you are. Let's see you come in, Mike. Well, thank you. Vice Chair, Judith Schwartz. Commissioner Arnie Ballantyne. Lisa Force. Okay, very good. Not here yet. Lisa Forcell. A.C. Johnson. Lauren Siegel, Terry Trumbull, and our council liaison, Eric Filseth. I think not here yet. Very good. So we do have an opportunity for oral communications. Why don't I keep rolling with it? Normally the commissioners themselves would run this, but oral communications, I don't think we received any. This would be an opportunity for someone to speak on items that are not part of the agenda. Since we've got a specific agenda, would you like to speak on something not on the agenda? We will do that in a moment when we come back to the presentation. So thank you. Wow. All right. Well, I guess we will start that now. All right. So again, just a little bit of framing, if you don't mind. Our goal this evening is to engage the commission. We've got city staff here in support, as well as really, most importantly, community members in identifying aspects of resilience that are important to our community, and start to explore the role that the utilities department, utilities in general, currently plays, and how this might evolve in a new and evolving vision of community resilience here in Palo Alto. This year, City of Palo Alto updated our utilities strategic plan, and during this process, we heard from a number of stakeholders that resilience is an important dimension of the role and how we look at our utilities services within the city in terms of electric, natural gas services, the potable water and wastewater collection services, and that we should be thinking about this role more deeply in supporting and facilitating community resilience more broadly. At the same time, we received as many definitions or descriptions on what resilience means, and so I'll read off a few examples here. One, maintaining financial viability in volatile markets and under rapidly changing regulatory systems. Two, adaptation for environmental and climate change. Three, building redundant infrastructure to ensure continuity of utility services. Fourth, defining minimum emergency scenario commitments and continuation of services and targeting service recovery times. Fifth, customer communications and transparency about what to expect when there is a utility service outage and priorities for recovery. Next, ability to meet the needs of the city locally and reduce dependence on the statewide grid or requirements for transmission from areas outside of the city. And finally, a diversity and security of our water and electric resources. So as you might imagine, a variety of different dimensions and descriptions for what resilience could mean here in Palo Alto. Given these range of ideas or issues, we decided that a good next step would be to engage with our UAC and the community as we are tonight in a discussion of understanding the intersection between the community assets that are our infrastructure and the potential hazards, as well as to begin a discussion of resilience needs related to utility services. The utility investments in infrastructure are typically large, in the millions of dollars, and long-term with lifespans, life expectancies that would span decades. One might view the analogy of our utility infrastructure as something of a large ocean liner, in that the complexity and the critical mass of investment that's somewhat applicable. Or one might also consider it in the terms of perhaps of a fleet of a variety of different types of investment. Important from the perspective that if you consider that changing direction on the way and the priorities that exist in investments as well as the existing practices are difficult to turn on a dime, and certainly do want to take into consideration that any change in direction in a dramatic manner could strand some assets, and certainly wouldn't want to do so without significant thought. So with that sort of background, a few questions that we'll want to begin to pose this evening, and that this would potentially lead to follow-up discussions that we'll have certainly with the Utility Advisory Commission, but also with the community broadly. First, how should our role in building public infrastructure be balanced with encouraging private investment and development on individual properties? And are we the utility owner of the infrastructure, a partner in ownership of infrastructure, or a facilitator of investments by others? Second, what investments should be prioritized from the utility to make us more resilient, while at the same time meeting other city needs such as sustainability, environmental sustainability, as might be the case in solar power investments with storage or batteries more commonly known. And third example of the questions we might explore is how is resilience impacted by our staffing strategies and our human resources, such as the availability and priorities for key personnel in response to disaster recovery needs. There are a number of similar questions that we'll be considering and begin to explore tonight. So we'll begin with some panel discussion, but at this point, let me turn it over to Mindy Craig, our facilitator, who will guide us through the evening.
Great, thanks, Ed. Good evening, everyone, and our afternoon. Thank you so much for coming here for this pretty packed afternoon. As Ed told us, there's a lot of considerations here. And I just want to let us know that this is actually a two-part series. Today is really about learning, coming up with a common vocabulary, hearing what the city has already done, and starting to begin to establish some goals, priorities, and a vision for what resiliency might mean. And then in the next one, we're going to start talking about solutions. And I know it's really hard not to solve everything today, but we're going to try not to. So let's try and look at where are our priorities, how do we help the utilities focus that big ocean liner as we go forward. So let me just go over what we're going to do today. We're going to start off with a great panel, and I'll introduce those in just a moment, of some experts out in the field who are going to give us some perspectives, broad in their scope. Then we're going to have our staff come in from the Palo Alto and talk about some of the things that they've already done as the utility, help you understand some of the studies that have been done, where we are, and where you should be thinking about these kind of big issues on resilience. And then we're going to start with a video that I'll tell you more about when we get to it, that's going to hopefully open your eyes and kind of give us all a urgency that this is an important thing for us to think about here in California, and particularly in the Bay Area, with so many different things that potentially can impact us, impact the utility. And then we're going to start actually group discussion. You guys will finally get to talk. We'll shut up. And we'll start talking about what resiliency actually means to the city of Palo Alto. Because as much as anybody here can say this is what the textbooks say, this is what so-and-so says, it really matters what you as a community think resilience means to you. And that's really what this evening's about, is to understand what the city of Palo Alto wants and thinks is important. Then we're going to do a breakout sessions, and each one of you will have a set of materials and conversation at each table, and we'll go into what those details are. We're going to come back, identify some priorities, and identify what our next steps are. So that's it. Anybody have any questions before we get the ball rolling? Yes, sir.
Yeah, it seems like it's just dominated by a corporate perspective. I don't hear anything about families or small businesses or anything like that. Am I in the wrong place?
Absolutely not. No, that's, really these small groups. We're getting a perspective that's pretty big, and the city was going to provide more of that, in the more community-based ones. And then those conversations in the small groups, we're going to have 2 tables just on people and community. We'll have 2 tables on economy, 2 tables on natural environment. So we're really going to dig into that in that last hour. So you're absolutely right. We want to go for each level of the conversation. Okay, great. Well, let me bring up our panelists here, and we're going to have all 3 of them come sit up here. We're on a fairly tight schedule because we're so packed, so they're going to each give us a nice presentation. We'll have a few minutes for some questions. And I'm going to say, Corinne, are you going to be the start kickoff speaker? All right. So Corinne Bartscher from Urban Area Security Initiative. Do you want to stand up there and you're going to? Excellent. Perfect. All right, you're on. It should be on, yeah.
Good evening. I'm Corinne Bartshire with the Bay Area UASI. Thank you for having me here. I am going to take us very regional from a city of Palo Alto perspective to a 12 county-wide perspective. The Bay Area UASI stands for Urban Areas Security Initiative. So we've been funded since 9/11 happened in 2001 by the Homeland Security Act of 2002. The San Francisco Bay Area receives Urban Area Security Initiative funding from the Department of Homeland Security now. And for the last several years, we've gotten about $30 million a year for this 12 county region to focus on preventing terrorism, counterterrorism, preparedness activities. And we've really developed some great, more collaborative preparedness, all hazard preparedness activities throughout the Bay Area, leveraging these funds. So I'm going to talk to you about some of that and how Palo Alto has been participating, and you'll hear some more details about the city a little later on. So one of the things that we do as a regional entity, we have a staff of about 12 people. We're not huge. We're not trying to use all of the Bay Area's funds on staff time, but we do help manage the funds and coordinate some of the key regional projects. And one of the things that as a recipient of these funds we are required to do as a region is prepare a threat and hazard identification and risk assessment. You should be proud that you are one of the local jurisdictions, maybe the only local jurisdiction in the Bay Area region that has your own City of Palo Alto threat and hazard identification and risk assessment. It is a very helpful tool and perspective and way of looking at threats, risk across the region. It's pretty logical that we can say that earthquakes, floods, fires don't really obey jurisdictional boundaries. They're not going to stop when they get to the line of, you're entering Palo Alto, and say, oh no, Palo Alto's prepared, we're good, the fire's not going to come in here, right? Or the floods. So the regional THIRA lets us look at the high consequence, high probability, high risk hazards for the Bay Area as a whole: earthquake, flood, wildfire. And we have several human-caused and terrorism scenarios in our THIRA. It is a for official use only document, but all of the 12 counties and local jurisdiction staff have access to the regional THIRA. It does take into account the interconnectedness of utilities and transportation, all the conversations of power, fuel, water. If you don't have one of these, how is it impacting access to the others? And so by doing this regional view of our most likely, most high consequence scenarios and discussing with subject matter experts throughout the Bay Area, throughout each of the counties, what are the impacts of a big wildfire scenario? What are the impacts of an earthquake? What are the impacts of a complex coordinated terrorist attack? How does that impact your utilities and people moving around and access to power and fuel? We do that at a regional level and share that with our local jurisdictions. Additionally, one of the things that our staff does to facilitate conversations throughout the Bay Area is manage several working groups, and these ebb and flow over time to what is important most and what folks at the local level are working on so that we can facilitate regional conversations. We have a public information and warning work group that talks a lot about interoperability of radios and alerting systems. I'm sure many of you are familiar with SCC Alert here in Santa Clara County. And so we talk regionally about how can we coordinate these programs and how can we coordinate across public information sharing, because our residents and our community members are traveling to and from all of our communities in the Bay Area every day. Personally, I chair the Emergency Management Work Group, and I'll give you a few highlights on that. CBRN PRND is the chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, explosives, sad stories that I try not to think about. And we do have a medical and public health. We keep those folks at local and private sector agencies close hold for coordinating across the region and preparedness efforts. The Bay Area UASI funds a large training program that is free to public sector employees throughout the region, and we offer law classes for law enforcement, classes for fire, classes for emergency management, emergency medical, public information. And so we have a work group that coordinates which classes should be offered when and where to get the most bang for our grant dollars. And new this year, we just initiated a cyber resilience work group, bringing IT folks together from the local agencies around the Bay Area to see where we can maximize dollars and effort. So we are putting on some training courses that benefit the entire region, and I'm sure more will come out of that work group. As an example, I wanted to show you some of the things that the emergency management work group has focused on for the last few years, because that's, I think, where the community in general and the utilities can really relate. That's where we do the all hazards, everything is connected conversations. And even though we know that everything is connected, we have to take off a bite that we can chew and focus on an area and keep moving through all the different challenges. So in 2015, before the Super Bowl was here at Levi's Stadium, we worked with our Bay Area stakeholders to talk about large special events planning in general, and how do we share law enforcement and security and that sort of planning and knowing if something does happen, which hospitals are we going to send it to, cross-jurisdictional boundaries, etc. 2016, we looked at commodity points of distribution, which is the concept of if everything is out, utilities are out, and folks are going to need water and food, life-sustaining supplies. These points of distribution would be in your communities and able to distribute water and food to the community. So we exercised that in fall of 2016. In the last 2 years, we've been focusing on care and shelter operations. Sheltering in the North Bay fires has been a big topic in the news, and San Jose had all the sheltering in early 2017 from the floods. So we've been working with our emergency management, our local agencies, Red Cross and partners, and focusing on how can we build local agency capabilities to shelter the community when that's needed. And we actually have a region-wide exercise next week on shelter operations, which Palo Alto is participating in. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then we're looking forward to a few years on critical transportation and bringing in our state and federal partners, CHP, and all of these other 3-letter agencies that I'm going to learn in the next couple of years, and how they're planning at the federal and state level of how they would help us in a catastrophic earthquake links to local planning. And so those are the kinds of conversations we have at the regional level. Everything that we produce, it's grant funded, available for the public, and for all local jurisdictions and agencies, private sector partners to benefit from as well. So you can go to this link on our website, bayareauwasi.org/programs catastrophic planning, and our toolkits and templates and things that we've developed through these efforts are available. We also have started offering a technical assistance program to local agencies. If you have an agency that's related to any of the efforts that we are working on, anything that's related to any of the efforts we've done over the last few years, we can come out to the local agencies and bring folks up to speed and let them know how they can benefit from those tools and templates. This is just an example of how one of our capability building projects goes across the region and the variety that it includes. So for care and shelter, we really focused on building the capabilities, understanding roles and responsibilities of all the agencies, sharing best practices, but we also worked through and provided tools to help local agencies and our partners do their planning. We have funded purchasing of equipment, shelter trailers over the last couple of years, including some animal supplies, medical supplies for shelters, and then we continue to coordinate training, mostly with the Red Cross, on shelter fundamentals and shelter management. And I mentioned exercising. Every year we exercise with an emergency management focus, and we align that with our capability building. So the last 2 years has been on shelter exercising, and this next week around the Bay Area we'll actually have 55 emergency operations centers, department operations centers throughout the Bay Area activating, and 18 shelters within the Bay Area doing a live we call it full-scale exercise of having volunteers walk in and pretend that they are being shelter residents, so that our jurisdictions really get the practice of operating a shelter. I spoke mostly to my slide before clicking it. But you can see that we've been exercising all of these things. Palo Alto has been participating since the beginning of time, before I can know, in these exercises every year. Santa Clara County has been a big participant, and so I think it's safe to say that your staff at OES here are looking out for the all-hazard connection and benefiting from what we can provide at a regional level. That is everything that I have. Do you want me to take questions later, or?
Yeah, let's. I think why don't we have everybody, and then we'll take some time at the end. And I think some of the things that Corinne really brought to mind, and why we wanted to start first, is this idea of interconnectedness. That we cannot be an island unto ourselves, and all the materials and thinking that's already going on in the Bay Area is a huge resource for us. So I think it's something for us to keep in our mind as we move forward. So we'll get to questions at the end of this, but Josh, why don't you come on up? Do you want to do the same? Josh Hellenberg from Nexent is going to talk to us about some of the economic impacts that can happen through this. So Debbie's going to get the...
Hi everyone, glad to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm from Nexent. We're a software and services company based out of San Francisco, almost entirely focused on electric utilities. So today I'm primarily going to be talking about electric system resilience. And it's a really tough nut to crack, and there's been a lot of folks who have thought about this, but it's a real challenge to assess the risk if you're considering a resilience investment for the electric system. You know, if you're assessing the risk over the lifetime of a 20 to 50 year investment, it's very challenging because you have to identify all of the relevant power interruption scenarios. You have to forecast the probability of those different scenarios under different investments, like with or without the investment is the most simple one, of course. And then you got to estimate the economic impact of each scenario. So it's a very challenging problem. It sounds very simple on the surface. Well, let's just compare the risk of different investments relative to the cost of each investment, and then you choose, you know, the most cost-effective one. But this has been a big challenge that folks around the country have been grappling with, including large utilities and all the way up to the federal government level. And as I was saying, you know, there's also just the challenge that these events are infrequent, right? Any sort of situation where you might have an outage lasting multiple days or weeks, thankfully in this country are quite infrequent. So there's just not many data points to show us what happens in those scenarios and what types of costs businesses and society as a whole experience. And then also, you know, the impacts of one of these very long duration outages can be really catastrophic, especially when you're looking at critical infrastructure like hospitals and police stations and fire stations losing power for multiple days or weeks. You know, that's just something that's not very well understood, at least from, you know, the economic perspective, understanding the specific cost to society. And then you also have the effect of, you know, in the interconnected world that we live in, that if businesses or people here lose their jobs, or the businesses, you know, experience a significant cost, there's a spillover effects to other parts of the state or maybe other parts of the world, given how interconnected we are, and how many, you know, business-to-business economic relationships there are, as well as business-to-consumer and households that are employed by the businesses. So as I was saying, identifying and resolving these challenges with assessing resilience investments for the electric system is something that there's been a lot of effort, and it's definitely increasing in focus just because of the number of the increasing frequency and severity of significant disasters. So this is a map from NOAA looking at last year, and they look at what they call billion-dollar weather and climate disasters. And last year was actually, you know, had the largest cost based on their estimates to society as a whole as a result of these 17 different billion-dollar disasters. And what's interesting is a lot of the debate about resilience started with Superstorm Sandy that went up the East Coast and really damaged New York and other, coastal areas in the Northeast. But last year that area didn't experience anything. But then you also, and there also weren't, any earthquakes, at least in California. But you still had flooding and wildfires and tornadoes. So there's all of these issues that are really impacting the electric system in many cases, and can also lead to significant long duration outages. So just wanted to make sure folks were aware that there's some upcoming reports by the Department of Energy, Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and Nexent that provide some guidance and recommendations for how to assess the costs and benefits of resilience investments. The one on the left is a guide looking at extreme weather and investments in electric system resilience. In this case, if you're looking at an earthquake scenario, potentially, that obviously isn't a weather event, but the economics of it and how you assess the potential investments, the whole approach around that is very similar. So that guide, once it's released, hopefully next month, can be helpful. And then on the right, there's a white paper that Nexent developed as part of participating in a workshop on electric system resilience with the Department of Energy several months ago. And that was a workshop in which we participated with some of the leading academics from around the country that have been looking at this issue, most notably Granger Morgan from Carnegie Mellon. And that they're going to take all the white papers and create this compendium that's going to be this a paper that Lawrence Berkeley Lab is going to release sometime in the next couple months. And again, it's looking at frontiers in the economics of widespread long duration power interruptions. So, aside from that work, Nexent has done a lot of studies for utilities, mostly, quite large utilities, looking at the value of grid resiliency. So for PG&E, we did a study looking at what the impact of an earthquake could be in terms of serving power to the downtown San Francisco area. San Diego Gas and Electric, they were looking at issues with wildfires and potentially losing power to southern Orange County completely for several weeks. I'm going to provide a little bit more information on those studies, and then also did some other related resilience studies for Puget Sound Energy, Georgia Power, and EPB, which is a small municipal utility in Chattanooga. So we have a lot of experience looking at this and understanding the economic impacts. I'm going to dive in, though, on this scenario for PG&E, where they were looking at a vulnerability for the two transmission lines that were serving downtown San Francisco, or the Embarcadero substation. So at the top right is the Embarcadero, top right of the picture on the left is the Embarcadero substation right there in downtown San Francisco. And the vulnerability that PG&E identified was that there was only two transmission lines going up the peninsula from Potrero, and they both crossed over, the major fault there. So they figured if there's an earthquake that, although there are two lines and you have that redundancy built in, both of those lines could be severed by the same event. So they were really concerned about this particular scenario, and they looked at a $200 million transmission line investment that, as it shows by this red arrow, that drops into the bay and comes up and serves in the Embarcadero substation through a different route that doesn't cross the earthquake fault. So PG&E filed testimony and did a lot of cost-benefit analysis. This was a few years ago, and the CPUC approved the investment, which has now been built and is currently in service. So the study we did for them there, getting back to looking at the economic impacts of outages, was really understanding what the cost is to businesses in downtown San Francisco, including small and medium businesses, not just the large ones. And as you can see here, the column that shows the direct cost, so that's the cost that the businesses themselves directly experience. It gets up into the billions of dollars once you're looking at an outage that might last multiple weeks. And then we also looked at like indirect costs, like I was mentioning before, if there's spillover effects to the greater economy. And that is based on research that we reviewed, is a multiplier of anywhere from 0.5 to 2 times the direct cost. So this is looking at about 3,000 business accounts and 24,000 residential accounts in downtown San Francisco, which is not very large. I think maybe even the city of Palo Alto has more accounts than that. But the cost gets up into the billions of dollars. And this was based on actually surveying businesses in downtown San Francisco. So it's not just some analysis that we made up. We actually went and talked to the businesses, including a lot of small businesses. And as it shows on the bottom of this slide, there's also significant employment impacts, in terms of just not paying your part-time workers. More than 1 out of 5 small and medium businesses report that they would most likely just go out of business completely if there was an outage lasting 3 to 7 weeks. So, obviously that's a huge concern. And then also, like I said, there's just the issue of just businesses not being able to pay, first their part-time employees, but then eventually they might need to, might not be able to pay full-time employees as well. And then here's a similar study we did for San Diego. In this case, we did not do a survey directly of the customers in South Orange County, but it was a similar case where they were looking at the transmission lines serving South Orange County and the potential for a wildfire taking out that line, leading to potential outages lasting to 3 weeks. And again, the cost gets into the billions. In this case, it was around 8,500 business accounts and a little over 100,000 residential accounts. And so we've done a lot of these studies looking at the value of electric reliability, and very high in the Bay Area. There's just a huge value on electricity just by nature of the very high level of productivity of our businesses here. And the costs are actually, when you normalize by the amount of usage, the cost is actually highest though for like small and medium businesses, just because small and medium businesses aren't as easily able to shift their production from one time period to another like a larger manufacturer might be able to do. So we did a survey for PG&E that looked at their entire service territory, and it did in fact find that costs per kWh were significantly higher across residential, business, and agricultural customers in the Bay Area. And agricultural includes wine country, so obviously very productive agriculture in the Bay Area as well. So just to wrap up, some key takeaways here regarding the estimation of the impacts of long duration power interruptions. Definitely don't want to make it seem like everything's figured out here. There's still a lot of ongoing methodological debate and challenges related to understanding those economic impacts. But based on some prior studies we've done, a power interruption lasting multiple weeks in the Bay Area could cost billions of dollars, even for a relatively small population, as I've shown. And this estimate could be further refined, like we've done for many other utilities. But obviously there's some work there, especially if you want to conduct a survey of Palo Alto businesses and households specifically. That can get into the hundreds of thousands of dollars just for a study, which most utilities probably don't want to go that route just because of the cost of the study. But we have so much data from other studies that we've done for PG&E especially that can be used in order to assess economic impacts here if the estimate needed to be further refined. But a key thing here is that the critical infrastructure impacts may require a separate assessment. Looking at potential for microgrid or grid islanding capabilities specifically for critical infrastructure. The surveys that we do are just kind of broad samples of PG&E's entire population, or specifically in downtown San Francisco. So you don't really end up really understanding for those specific critical infrastructure facilities, again, like the hospitals and the police stations and fire stations. You don't really, as well as a wastewater treatment is a huge issue as well, if power is lost. So we don't really get into really understanding those impacts because we're surveying businesses about the direct impacts to them, but obviously critical infrastructure in particular can have these huge spillover effects to other businesses and households in the area if there are issues with delivering water or treating water, as well as just safety by having your fire department or police department up and running properly. So again, we've done these studies that suggest that an outage lasting multiple weeks in the Bay Area could cost billions of dollars, and that might not even necessarily include a full understanding of all of the critical infrastructure impacts. So thank you. Look forward to further discussion.
Great, thanks, Josh. So let's see, we're now going to have Benson come up, and Benson Joe from ABB Enterprise Software come up and talk more about sort of integration issues. But I think one of the things that will be a challenge for all of us tonight is that this is not a small problem. This is not something that we can kind of dive into and kind of, we got the answer. We'll be talking a lot about this. This is why we're sort of setting the stage here today. So that's why we also don't want to come up with solutions, because it's a big questions, and we'll be balancing a lot of these investment questions and how do we work with the utilities to make the best choices for our community. So keep on going with that.
Can I ask you not to use so many acronyms? Some of us don't know.
Absolutely, yeah, and yeah, I think we all have to make sure we don't speak in our energy talk or utility talk. So kilowatt hours was KWH was one of those that I heard. So we'll try and do that. Thanks. Go ahead, Benson.
Okay, thank you, Mindy. I'm going to build off what Corinne and Josh talked about. Josh mentioned a concept about microgrids and that being providing.
Oh.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Okay.
good.
Sorry about that. I'm going to build off what Josh and Corinne spoke about grid resiliency and microgrids and how that might play in providing. I think a lot of us, we take for granted that when we turn on the lights come on, right? You don't turn on lights and flick the light switch and like, where's the light, right? There's a lot of things that happen that come into play when you do that. I heard the analogy of the earthquake, and I think I want to kind of reminisce a little bit because I grew up in San Francisco, and most of you must remember 1989, the Loma Prieta earthquake. Getting ready to watch the World Series, and the earthquake happens, and we lose power at my house for I think it was about 2 days. And as a kid, that was the greatest thing in the world. I get to play with flashlights, candles. We get the barbecue. But as an adult, you see the economic impact. People don't go to work. We throw out all the food in our refrigerator. There's a value that's lost. There's a value if you have some redundancy, if you have a microgrid, or you strengthen your distribution system, you have some redundancy on your system. And now we have the technology today that if we didn't want to rely on what we call the bulk power system, you can have your own little power system within city limits. You could have it, a lot of you have distributed generation or solar on your rooftops. That provides you some sense of power, but there's still some issues there. I mean, you can't rely on those all the time. We do have a system that's pretty well interconnected, and I want to start at a very high level in terms of where your power supply comes from at the transmission level, moving down to more of the distribution level, and then maybe even possibly like microgrids as a possible solution to meet some of your power supply needs. Because I think that everybody wants low-cost power, and they want the power on at all times, especially when you talk about catastrophic events, not just sort of normal everyday events where a tree knocks down a line and you lose power for a couple hours, and your hardworking utility workers come out and fix your line, and all of a sudden you got power back. So we have, a lot of regulations that I think the city planners will be talking about later. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but there is a 50% renewable standard that's going to be implemented by 2030. So a lot of the utilities in California, including City of Palo Alto, will be increasing their renewable procurement, which means less dependency on natural gas technology and technologies that emit carbon. We also have very ambitious goals to reduce carbon, which sort of work in parallel with the RPS goals. It's 40% by 2030. There are some proposals out there to even further reduce the GHG requirement, reduce GHG by 80% from 1990 levels.
Benson, can you make sure not to use those acronyms? So RPS is Renewable Portfolio Standards and greenhouse gases, sorry.
Right. And then we have, again, acronym city is Senate Bill 100. And so essentially what Senate Bill 100 says that the city utilities need to be 100% clean energy by 2045. So that doesn't mean that you're getting rid of some of the natural gas plants in the that you might own, but you're using hydro, solar, wind, and other resources to offset some of your carbon emitting resources. So that's some of the regulatory and landscape that that I want to kind of go over. And as my expertise is in the resource planning and in the microgrid advisory business. So that's kind of the area that I want to kind of, hopefully you leave this presentation, you got to have a sense of the decisions and the economic criterias that the city planners and the community has to think about in terms of, well, how do we best deploy our money? How do we spend money in the most effective way to provide reliability and also to make sure that the grid is resilient should, an earthquake happen? I mean, I grew up, drop, deck, and cover. So, I mean, I remember drop, duck, and cover, in school. So that, and I haven't done that in 30 years. So it's been a while. So it's really interesting in, when we look at, what's in, what's the forecast for the future for generation. So the California ISO, or the CAISO, the acronym, is the organization that manages the transmission system for California. And they manage a lot of the power supply that, feeds that the city contracts for. What's in the queue right now is, well, there's 8,000 megawatts of solar, 3,000 megawatts of wind, and 12,000 megawatts of energy storage. So clearly, if you're talking about grid resiliency, we believe that likely that energy storage is going to play a big role. What type of role, that's still up for discussion. There's still a lot of resiliency studies and analysis to be done, because while storage is a very nice resource, it is still pretty expensive. So there are some trade-offs there where you can't just throw a ton of money at energy storage and renewables and say, well, that's the solution, because there are some trade-offs. When it comes down to this, for renewable energy, you hear all these goals about 100% renewable power and having more solar, more wind. Well, the problem with having a lot more renewables is balancing the system. At its core, the system operator has to make sure that instantaneous supply of generation and instantaneous supply of demand is always matched up. And it's problematic when you have a lot of solar and wind on the system, because while it's sunny right now, you don't know when the cloud comes across and blocks out your solar, right? You lose the solar. Well, you're going to lose reliability if you don't have other resources to manage that. Likely, the power system is pretty well built. It's very resilient, and as Josh mentioned, it's highly reliable, right? So under normal operating conditions, it's fairly standard. You don't really see a lot of outages, but what happens when there is an earthquake or there's a wildfire, and I don't know if this is true or not. Maybe Deborah can tell me, but I was told that there's only a single line that connects the city of Palo Alto to the California ISO. So what only separates, I mean, you could have as much power supply lined up as possible, but the truth is, if you lose that transmission line due to some event, a transformer blowing, a substation, a terrorist event, you're going to be out of power for weeks, most likely. 3 lines, okay. Okay. So somewhat days. But that's part of the discussion about grid resiliency is you have to ask yourself as a community, what are you able to live with? You know, is 1 day acceptable? Is 1 week acceptable? Because there's lost productivity. There's lost value to your community if you don't have power, especially the small businesses that I think Josh mentioned is, well, if we don't have people working for 2 or 3 weeks, you know, you could be out of business. So I'm going to skip some of these slides, but the takeaway here is that when you have a lot of renewables on the system, the reliability of the system gets tougher and tougher. So, and I think that's one of the takeaways I would like the community to understand is that, yes, we can do more renewables, but it makes things tougher for reliability and grid resiliency because you don't have the traditional resources, natural gas, that are available instantaneously, short of energy storage. But of course, there are cost considerations. Well, I mentioned earlier that, well, some of you have probably solar in your rooftop, and you could probably add a lot more solar on a rooftop, but there are some challenges if you have too much solar on the rooftop, because you could have conditions where you have too much generation and not enough load, and actually that power flows backwards into your community, you know, most likely to your home, to your neighbor's home, to your business, and that could cause some damage to your equipment. So those are some you know, considerations to keep in mind of. So the other option is if, you know, you talk about grid resiliency and you look at more at catastrophic events. What's the value of having redundancy? Do you want a microgrid? Is making sure that your power is always going to be on regardless if there's a wildfire or some type of contingency or even an earthquake. What's that? I mean, the technology is available today, and part of my practice is helping communities, helping businesses determine what's the value proposition of microgrids. Because if you want to throw money at equipment and you know, building more equipment and building a microgrid, you could always solve the problem and you could always have that power, but there's a cost trade-off to that. And so that, I think, as a community, as stakeholders, you have to work with your local utility to figure out, well, what's the business proposition? What's the payback period? What are the financials behind that? I have a business case that I'm not going to go over, but it's essentially when you want to make sure that you have reliability and grid resiliency, you can either upgrade the distribution system or you can build a microgrid. So there's just different ways you can deploy money, and one may be better than the other. It could be a microgrid. It could be increasing investment in substation and transformers. It depends, you know, and that's something that those are type of studies that ABB will do. So I'm not going to, you know, just kind of go through these business cases. They're a little bit technically dense, so I'm going to leave some time for some questions.
Fantastic. I'm going to see if I can turn these lights on without breaking the whole electric grid here. So do we have a few questions here for our panelists? We got a lot of different information. Oh, look at magic. A lot of good information here, and it's a little bit overwhelming. And this is really focused on electric. I do want to just note that that's only one of the 5 utilities that your utility department is going to be managing. So we'll be also talking today about water, about gas, about the sewer, and then communications as well. So do we have any questions on, yes?
Josh told us about the big one, when a major transmission line to downtown San Francisco goes out, for example, how much business is lost. $1 billion a day was the takeaway I got from that. But we have lots of little power outages going on all the time. Maintenance, a tree falls down here and there, substation blows up. Is there any quantitative information on how much business is lost as a result of that? Kind of what's the fluctuation in the business lost when we don't even notice it?
Yeah. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. There's actually more research in that area that's been going on for a couple of decades with Lawrence Berkeley Lab as well, looking at more everyday outages, and we've done a lot of surveys in that area. It's actually a little bit easier to ask people about those scenarios because it's something they might be familiar with, just experiencing like a 1 or 2 hour outage. So yeah, there's a lot of work in that area as well. Just to clarify though, the billions of dollars of impact was more like once you start getting into like the multiple weeks of outages in that scenario. It's not like per day. I think per day it was like 100,000 or 100 million or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that question is going back into sort of that microgrid discussion is a lot of the outages happen when a tree falls down or some type of overload on a substation. So you could take your money and say, well, I want to upgrade the substations, make it more resilient, so that, or do some more, put some more money in tree trimming, make sure that the distribution line is a little bit more solid. Or you can say, well, what if I build a microgrid, and during times when there's a big storm coming in, I can go into an islanded mode, which means you're essentially disconnected from the bulk power system, and you work your microgrid as an island, so the city would be like kind of an island. So there's some trade-offs there about, well, where's the best way of deploying the capital that you want to pump into your power supply.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good remark, and I don't know if you guys want to talk a little bit more about that, which is the idea about resiliency isn't emergency planning. So it's a little different. So we have emergency planning baked into it, but the benefit of resiliency might actually be more than that. So it might cover this idea of having a better community or better resources without an emergency disaster, and then also recovering at the end of that. So I don't know if you've talked about that balancing of benefits that you might accrue ahead of time and the investments in the case of emergency. I don't know if that makes sense, and if you can talk to that.
There's a question there.
Oh, great.
Maybe. No, gentleman.
Oh, great.
In front
Yes.
here.
So if we just think about business continuity. Thanks. If we just think in terms of business continuity, if risk is, if the big events are relatively rare, then they can be monetized and you can spread that risk and use insurance as a vehicle to offset the risk. Obviously, there are many other impacts that are not business continuity, but how do you decide whether to spend money on an ongoing basis for insurance to cover a risk versus investing in upgraded infrastructure that's more risk resilient? How do you conceptualize that?
So we looked at that as part of the San Francisco study as well, and seems like, most businesses don't think their insurance would cover any of the damages beyond just physical damages, obviously. But yeah, there is like business interruption insurance, but I don't think it's available for these types of very high. Yeah.
So, FEMA has a flood insurance program, right? And if we had some sort of a energy resilience program that was like FEMA flood insurance, that was somehow, if you're in a risk-prone area, you have to get mandatory insurance. It's not necessarily a good vehicle, but it's a vehicle. It's a choice. So how do you draw the line between where you want to invest for infrastructure versus? I think my question still stands.
Again, I'm just not sure there's an insurance product out there that would cover this, and whatever other investment you might consider is your insurance in many ways. So
Let me just quickly try to answer that. Let's say you go out and buy a TV, right? And the first thing they say, well, do you want to buy the extended warranty? So it's the same decision making. Like, do you want to get the insurance just in case, or do you want to say, well, let me just buy this TV, and if it fails, then I'll buy another one. And so you look at your costs over a longer horizon over the lifespan of the project. And I think that's the same thing you would look at, those type of assets is like, if you invest in a substation or equipment, you're talking about 20, 30, 50-year lifespans amortized over that period versus an annual insurance payment. So there are ways of evaluating those type of,
And it's the gentleman in the back in the blue t-shirt, and then up here. So, back further a little bit, Deb. Do you want to raise your hand? There we go. Yeah.
So I'm interested in Corinne's threat work. So we've had some major fires, the Mendocino complex, the Yosemite fire. So did your threat work play any impact on helping those people prepare for anything? So tell me what the measure of success is for your threat work.
Thanks for, hello?
Yep.
Oh, thanks for listening. Unfortunately, our THIRA is very broad and regional in nature, and unlike the city of Palo Alto's THIRA, doesn't have, the regional one doesn't have strategic action steps that come out of it. So our THIRA says, hey, these are our risks, and gets us to, well, in general, we know that we would need this many resources in the Bay Area to tackle, respond, recover from that scenario. And unfortunately, our regional requirements have stopped. They stop at that point. The city of Palo Alto goes through that same process, but then identifies strategic actions and implementations. From what I've seen, the North Bay wildfires last fall happened exactly as our wildfire scenario for the Bay Area region was written out. So that validated that we are looking at and evaluating an appropriate scenario. And unfortunately, because these fires have happened so frequently in the last couple of years, from the North Bay fires last year to the current Mendocino complex and Carr fires, a lot of lessons real time are being shared from county to county and community to community. Residents are seeing what has happened firsthand to their neighbors, and I think that has been the most successful spark for being prepared at an individual, no pun intended with the spark. That has been the part that has really built community preparedness. I know I live in Marin County, right next to Sonoma County, which had a lot of the fires, and I've seen a lot of my neighbors practice. There was a small fire and they were in their cars ready to evacuate. They now know that in less than 5 minutes they can have their kids and all of their stuff loaded in the car and be out the door, and that's just because they've watched Sonoma County. So I think that whatever we write on paper in a government document that gets us the grant funding is great, and it does a lot of collaborative conversations that we have throughout the region, but it's the individual level in the community and helping your neighbors and encouraging your neighbors to prepare that I think is the best success.
And we're going to hear a lot more about that in a second. So I'm going to have time for maybe 2 more questions, and then we're going to go to the next. Oh, we got all of these 4 ones. Okay, so can we make it slightly quick, and we want to move on to their next panel. So gentleman here in black, and then we'll go to the back of the room.
Hi, thanks. I thought your comments about the impact on business of power loss were really interesting. And I wonder if we have, or it's possible to assess, do that same type of impact analysis on the Palo Alto businesses. When I was on the comp plan a couple of years ago, we had a single point of failure coming into the city for electricity, either one line or set of lines, that the entire city would lose power. One of the staff members seemed to be implying it's not as bad as it sounds. The first part of my question is it possible to do an fiscal impact analysis? And the second is, what is the actual state of that single point of failure that could be subject to sabotage or an earthquake or an accident, like we had a plane fly into the power lines and had a power outage?
Let me have you hold that, because our next panel is going to talk right about specific Palo Alto. So if it's about specific Palo Alto, we're going to do that in the next thing. So if it's about these guys, gentlemen in green, back there, our commissioner.
I guess I could say real quick, though, like I said, I mean, you could do a survey specifically of Palo Alto, but I also said that, there's so much data from like PG&E and similar businesses that you can kind of use some of the other research that's been done.
Okay.
Well, folks, I'm infamous for saying that technology won't save you, and I believe that tonight. It seems like you're counting on resiliency being quantitative, money, and corporate structure. I would like you to talk to qualitative values. When we put solar power on our roofs, there's a qualitative value add to that. But I hear nothing about qualitative here. Can you speak to that?
I'm not sure, I think these guys, we asked them to speak around these kind of very specific things, and I think what we're looking for is from you as a community to give us those values. I'm not sure if any of you guys have anything to add to that, but I think that value proposition is why we're here tonight. Because we have information, we're going to share in a few minutes what those data points are that the city has already created, and it's the community here in Palo Alto that has to help the utility understand the values. Where do we put those money? Where do we put our ship in together? And that's what we have to talk about tonight very clearly. These great people are not going to be able to tell you your values. Well, we're going to hear from you in a few minutes. We want to hear what you think. They're going to give us. I ask you to be patient, and we'll talk about that more. All right, this gentleman right over here, and then I think we're going to move on to our next panel. He's a gentleman right over in this thing, right? Raise your hand.
Well, and this follows up with Corinne's thing, and I think is a segue into what we're going to do. When I read the Palo Alto threat assessment last week, one of the things that seemed to me was missing was the interaction of the various systems, probabilistic risk assessment, or that kind of thing that shows how one system might affect another. The electric system affects water and sewage and so forth, and fuel pumping and so forth. So I'd like to, in this next session, hear something about how we do that, because that, I think, can make the case where there's a resiliency microgrid or something like that that we might want to invest in because it has the biggest bang for the buck.
Yeah, that's a really good segue for us. And I'm going to say thank you to our panelists very much. I appreciate your time. And so we're going to switch over to Ken Duker, who is with the City of Palo Alto's Emergency Services. And we have the magic lights down. Thank you, Hector. Appreciate that.
All right. Well, I think it's officially good evening now. It's 5 o'clock somewhere, and I think that somewhere is here. I'm Ken Duker. I'm going to be giving you, on behalf of staff, a little bit of more depth. We'll talk a little bit about a high level about the interconnectedness of all these different systems. The last questioner had an excellent point that we don't look at really any of these risks in a vacuum. So many of utilities, for example, are by definition interdependent. For example, we can't treat your sewage without electricity. If we don't have electricity, then we're on to diesel and so forth. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about today, and hopefully you all grabbed one of these, should be at your table, is our local community risks. So there's a little color brochure that says "Be Prepared" on the cover. Feel free to open it up, at least to the first flap, to the icons of doom. And we'll go through a little bit of this because, as the prior panel illustrated, this is actually a really, really difficult topic. It's not something, first of all, that human brains are well suited to understand. Most people, when they talk about risk, they're starting from an emotional factor rather than an empirical one, right? We are wired to be afraid of something that might kill us or hurt us or impair our ability to have offspring, if you want to be Darwinian about it, right? So one of the challenges that we start to think about a long-term process, and to Professor Iannucci's point, could you buy insurance? Could you find another way to mitigate? Maybe, but not everything in life, right? You wouldn't want to say, well, I have life insurance, therefore I'm not going to double check my parachute, out I go. So a lot of these are kind of nuanced. Everything I'm going to talk about today is up on our website, cityofpalto.org/public safety, so don't be afraid to look at that. So a little bit about the icons of doom. As Corinne Bartshire alluded to from UASI, we are one of the only jurisdictions, aside from the regional planning, and Bert Lawrence, by the way, kind of pointed out, the weakness of regional planning is that its granularity has to be at a very high level, right? All 12 counties in the Bay Area. It's not the job of UASI or ABAG or other regional planners to tell jurisdictions what to do. The best that we can hope to do is get consensus about what are the sorts of things that we need to prepare for and what are the best practices and sources of funding that we can get from here to there with. So this is an output that is specifically Palo Alto. This was a result of a multi-year process where we engaged stakeholders ranging from universities, our school district, Stanford Hospital, Palo Medical Foundation, and so forth, and of course our community groups. Could I get a raise of hands from the audience if you are an emergency services volunteer? Could you raise your hand? Okay, good. I'm glad we're preaching only somewhat to the choir, but the community members, there's a fellow in the back who was saying he was impatient. He wasn't hearing much about, hey, what are residents supposed to do? What are community values? I would encourage that person, if he hasn't run off, to talk to some of our emergency services volunteers at the break. This is very much a grassroots community risk assessment. This is not the government. It's not three-letter agencies telling us in Palo Alto what we should or should not focus on. This is what percolates out of a best practice that says that we need to look at three categories of risk. And this maps very directly onto our discussion about utilities and, as you said, sir, the interconnectedness of all of these things, right? The earthquake is kind of the easy one, right? You know that you're going to have destroyed infrastructure. Mr. Schellenberg pointed out that PG&E was looking at, they had the transmission line that transected a fault. Okay. But this gets you down to a forcing function that says you have to actually look beyond that. There are three categories of risks and hazards that could ultimately put us out of business, if you will. It could mean that there's no more Palo Alto, there's no more Silicon Valley, there's no more internet as we know it today. And we need to think very carefully as we go through all these. So the first one, I know it's a little hard to read with the crappy light bulb that's powering this projector, but they're natural disasters, which is, I think, right? I just want to be respectful. Do we have any tectonic deniers? Okay, just checking. Right, so since we all agree that we could have a major earthquake, and the USGS and other scientists tell us that we could have a major earthquake, I'm going to hopefully assume that you are, as logical people, taking mitigation actions, and that's described in this brochure under what you could do to get prepared. So I'll leave it at that. That's my jab at all of you tonight. So the earthquake's going to happen. It's going to clobber us. It's going to destroy a lot of things and make recovery very difficult. And one of the challenges for city staff, utilities in particular, is if you lose transportation, that's why it's on Corinne's long-term roadmap, that critical transportation, we are going to have a heck of a time getting off-duty employees in or having people commute to and from. We're also going to have a heck of a time getting supplies, material, giant transformers, by the way, some of which take a year to build because they're not in stock at Fry's or Amazon Prime, right? So that is a pretty tough one. Flooding and severe winter storms really are a major problem in the state of California. If you looked at the billion-dollar climate-related disasters, a number of them were flood storm related. Right now we're seeing fires, but flood and storm is still a big deal. The middle category gets ignored, and it's the one that I think precipitated today's meeting with on behalf of the UAC, which is accidental. In February of 2010, a small plane took off from Palo Alto Airport. Pilot zigged when he should have zagged. Flew into the one and only high-tension connection that we have to the grid. Whether or not there are three conductors on that tower doesn't really matter to me. What mattered to me is that we were without power. Now, in that case, some really, really great work by utilities and our supporting partners, including PG&E, allowed restoration in about 14 hours. But we shouldn't count on that. Accidents do happen, and accidents, to me, are the thing that really make grid resilience the most important thing to deal with, because you just never know what's going to cause them. So, and urban fire, by the way, falls into that. For those not familiar, if you were to get on Google Maps and just type in Palo Alto, CA, it might surprise you to see how much of the city limits are west of Highway 280 in a very high fire danger zone. So urban fire could cause a lot of issues for us, including our water utility and other bits of our utility structure. And finally, human caused. If you're not familiar, get on the interweb and look up the Metcalf San Jose sabotage, right? There are local recent cases of domestic or foreign terrorism attempts to destroy critical utilities infrastructure. That happens more than you might think. Sometimes it's disgruntled employees, sometimes it's people addicted to drugs stealing copper and amazingly not destroying themselves as they chop out copper from high voltage lines. So we won't have time to go through all this today. Again, this is a first workshop to set the stage and to get us to a baseline level of understanding about why we should do what we should do and why we should think about more than simplistic feel-good answers. My job is not to make you feel good in case you missed that, right? So it ultimately becomes less about what the disaster is and more about what are the anticipated consequences to that last guy's point, right? What is likely to occur when we have a major seismic shaker, right? The California PUC released a report about a year ago about the Hetch Hetchy water system. I know Corinne has read it. I believe their most rosy scenario is 6 months to 8 months before you get water back on the Hetch Hetchy water system. Yeah, that's going to be a very dry period of time, right? There's a lot of other things, human factor things, that we tend to ignore. We're talking about how might we make our utilities more resilient, but I'm interested in how do we make our community more resilient, which does get to the other gentleman's point. What are our shared community values? What are we as individual residents and business owners and churches and synagogues and whatnot, what are we willing to do and what are we willing to accept? Some of this stuff we've got to be adults about, that we could see a lot of unpleasant behavior and things that we think cannot happen in Palo Alto. And of course, they have happened in Palo Alto. We just are willfully ignorant of that. And they've happened, and they happen to this day the minute there's a crisis. Crisis can bring out the best in people and can bring out right away the worst in bad people. So the bottom line is that we're in this really, unfortunately, bubble-like experience in California. In Western recorded history, we have not been smacked by a Hurricane Katrina level event. We have not experienced what the people of Puerto Rico are still experiencing, where, yes, you can make jokes about, hey, their infrastructure wasn't great to start with, but we will be reduced to that level, and I will posit to you right now that we as a community will do less well because many of us are clinically addicted to 4G coverage and Whole Foods, right? So we need to think about all those things holistically when we move through the threat and hazards matrix. So it gets back to what we started with, which what is resilience? What should it mean to us, right? In my business, FEMA helps us, right? It's the ability to take a punch, dust yourself off, and get back to some reasonable level of functionality. If you boil all the fancy nomenclature down, that's what it's about. So do we know what's going to punch us? Do we know when? Maybe not. Are we willing to make hard investments? It's great, for example, to put photovoltaics on your roof until that first storm comes and you're flicking the light switch to the other speaker's point and the lights don't work and you're saying some fancy French words. I thought I just spent all this money on solar and you forgot that, well, you did good for the environment, but you did nothing for your individual resilience. So there are a lot of things that we need to think about. In my business here in public safety, our mission, right, is to prepare, prevent when we can, mitigate, respond to, and recover from all those terrible hazards that are in that brochure. There are a lot of complex things that go on. But I can tell you right now, you could give me 100 staff and it wouldn't make any difference at all. This is really mainly about what you're going to do as individuals, as nonprofits, as schools, as for-profit businesses. If you don't move the ball's not going to get moved. So a little bit about that Baylands case study. So, right, we have a lot of critical infrastructure, and during the breakout sessions, you're going to get some maps, and you're going to see what exists, not just utility critical infrastructure, but really important things. Palo Alto Airport, a lot of really important things that are in the greater Baylands, and that after an earthquake could be subject to liquefaction. So, right, February 17, 2010, private plane took off from Palo Alto Airport. That's an actual picture taken from the scene. I was one of the first police officers there. That, by the way, could have been a much worse scene. The plane crashed about 100 yards from a daycare. So tragic for the people who died on board the plane, but the loss of human life could have been a lot worse. So after that happened, the city quite reasonably started thinking, well, should we spend millions of dollars to mitigate the risk? As the prior panel said, it seems like, well, wouldn't that be an easy exercise to go through? And yet it's not. It's very nuanced. And so where we are today, we haven't done it. We have options, right? It could, some estimates are as high as $500 million to run a second transmission line. But wouldn't it be embarrassing if the city spent all that money to connect to the same grid and the grid fails farther upstream for reasons that we cannot control or even anticipate? So I think there are a lot of opportunities. Again, today is not about problem solving at all, and it's very tempting for those of us who've looked at this for a long time to lay things out, but they're all here on the table, and we welcome your input. We'd love creative and zany ideas, as long as they're backed up with some way to pay for them and actually do them. Again, I'm going to harp a little bit on telecommunications. Right? It's one thing to take a cold shower. It's one thing to get dressed in the dark. It's another thing to have no communications with your loved ones. I really think, from a public safety perspective, if you want to see a quick unraveling of our current culture, take away your smartphones for a while. See how that goes. So with that, I'll turn it over to Carla.
Thanks, Ken.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks. My name is Carla Daly, and I am with the Utilities Department. I have just a couple of quick slides. The gentleman in the middle mentioned just a couple of minutes ago the Palo Alto Comprehensive Plan. And I just want to point out the plan to make sure, as you're starting to get together as a community and talk about these issues, that you realize some of the documents that already exist that do address resilience in one way or another, and the comprehensive plan is one of them. While it's not, there it is. That's what it looks like. If you've never seen it, it's obviously on the web, but we have hard copies around somewhere. The comprehensive plan is not a utilities-driven document, but it does touch on utilities and resilience in a few different sections. This is an overview of the whole comprehensive plan, but the relevant sections are the natural environment section, where we talk a bit about long-term resiliency for water and energy, and then of course the safety section that talks about both community safety from some of the hazards that Ken highlighted, as well as a description of the utilities infrastructure and all the interconnections that we have. In the natural environment section, there are a number of goals and programs that might be relevant to what you're talking about. There's one about water resources and infrastructure that includes some projects to study the groundwater aquifers, which we are in the middle of doing right now, identifying groundwater recharge viability, which we're in the middle of doing right now, keeping the groundwater clean, which is an ongoing goal of ours, both in the utilities and in public works, and educating the residents on the risks associated with long-term drought. So that's more of a slow-moving disaster compared to an earthquake or a plane crash or something like that. There's also a section about cooperative planning with other agencies, because we do recognize that as much as we can plan ourselves here in Palo Alto, we are always going to be interconnected throughout the region with respect to all of these areas: water supply, sea level rise, fire protection, and so on. In the safety section of the comprehensive plan, we talk a lot about community awareness, and that's certainly plays into what we're doing here today, getting folks in the community together to talk about these issues. There are a number of specific projects outlined in that section, including the solution of adding a transmission line, exploring off-grid technologies, continuing to underground our utilities, which definitely makes our distribution system more resilient, enhancing the safety of our gas pipelines, and providing off-grid or backup power to critical city facilities. Switching gears just a little bit, I want to talk a bit more about water resilience, because much of the discussion today has focused on the electric grid, and certainly that's a critical asset here in the community, but water, I think, is right up there with taking people's cell phones away. We all need water. A number of years back, we did complete our emergency water supply plan, where we refurbished 5 older wells that were already existing in the city and developed 3 new wells, including a new underground water storage facility at El Camino Park. And so that has made our local distribution system much more resilient than it was before that project. We also have a project underway in coordination with the Santa Clara Valley Water District to really look at expanding local resilient water supplies, both water from the regional water quality control plant, so water reuse from the sewage plant, and along with that, studying the aquifer and trying to get a better idea of how we could use our groundwater on a more permanent basis. So those are long-term planning efforts, but they certainly add to the resilience of our water supply. As Ken talked about, the Hetchetchee system going down, we're less susceptible to those types of problems if we're relying on resources that we have here in the city. Again, with water, there are a number of these projects are regional in nature and really don't make any sense to do completely as an island, but we are working on all of those. That's it for me.
Good evening. So first of all, Ken, you've scared me. So Amazon Prime isn't my emergency plan? Okay. So I've had the opportunity for the past couple of years to work with our utilities engineering group. So I'm going to talk about something about what we do in engineering. It's often been more with a focus, or we've always thought about reliability rather than resilience. Although a lot of what we do for reliability also does kind of harden the system and make it more resilient to events. I just want to touch before we go on to that, though, about, so Carla is from our resource management division, talking about these alternative sources of water, because that really is a vital service that we all need. I think once you take away the cell phones, I think the loss of water is going to be more catastrophic on a long-term basis to a community. And also with communications, it's not just about being able to check in with your family. It's about us, the utility, the city, our emergency services, being able to communicate to everybody about what is happening and whether we need evacuation. So, the communication is also a vital part of resilience and emergency planning. On the electric side, I think Catherine probably will be very upset if most people here don't know that we are 100% carbon neutral on our electric supply. So we have been looking at kind of diversifying on supply side. So there's the one part of it. There's the supply side, diverse resources, and also local resources, especially as we've seen with the water utility. So now, kind of like going on to the engineering side, and we're thinking more about the distribution, the local system, our pipes and wires. How do we harden that system? And so there, when we think about resilience, we're thinking about prevention. What do we do to make the system more resilient, or kind of resistant, if you like, to breaking when things happen? And then there's recovery. What do we have planned for restoration when we lose power or water supply? And survivability. So what do we do when things have gone out? And again, I think the definition of resilience is or one of the definitions is how quickly can you recover or get into a kind of a functional mode again. So as far as prevention is concerned, in engineering, we're looking at what we call the critical infrastructure. So our pipes, wires, our maintenance, how can we build the system to withstand earthquakes, fires, or interruption from the grid? Ken mentioned liquefaction. Does everyone know what that term means? Living in an earthquake zone. We've got some real engineers here who can put me right, but basically it's when saturated soils have applied pressure to them, as in an earthquake, And they basically go from acting like a solid to acting like a liquid. And so if you've got pipes in there, think about brittle, hard pipes, things start moving around and the pipes will break. So one of the things we're looking at on for our water, wastewater and natural gas is replacing the pipes to things that will be more, shall we say, amenable to being in a liquid environment or a liquefaction area. We also look at our poles, our transformers. I mean, we have all these elements on our distribution systems for all our utilities, not just for the electric, that we are trying to harden, build in redundancy. We try on the electric system, we try not to load our systems up 100% so that when something goes wrong in one area, we can switch and keep things going. Obviously, vegetation management is really important with the electric utility. When we got wires, as mentioned, up in the foothills, we are in a high fire danger area, so vegetation management very important. And then also has been addressed is we lived in a world where cybersecurity is a real issue. And ever since I've been in my, I'd say the last 5 years that I've been working here at the city, I've had the pleasure about once a year about going to a conference and being scared witless about what's going on with cybersecurity. And yes, you know, they are in our systems. And I think the saying now, it's not that you've either been hacked or you're going to be hacked. It's either you know you've been hacked or you don't know yet. So we go with the assumption that, you know, people have access to our systems. So prevention strategies again, fire issues, moving overhead to underground, installing barriers, elevating equipment, relocating equipment away from threats, and the grid hardening, what we call thinking about increasing pole size, you know, just making things, I mean, it speaks for itself. It making it more resilient, harder, more resistant to breaking. And increased security. So we've been working on that for the past few years, better lighting, more cameras, perimeter detection around our key facilities like substations, water pumps, etc. What could be coming? We are certainly looking at smart grid pilots. That should help with at least being able to locate faults quicker on the system and being able to respond to them quicker. Battery storage, again, that's been mentioned by our speakers today. We definitely think that that's going to be coming. Just a little history for me. I started in utility industry in '94, and we were all excited about microgrids then. So I'm really hoping that 25 years later, we might actually be getting somewhere. And then recovery. Of course, we have recovery plans. We are, you know, way ahead of the game with Ken and his group. We have our own utilities emergency disaster recovery plan. We have on-call field staff. So we have staff that are, I think our requirement is that they have to be within 30 miles of the city because we really don't have many people that actually live local, and we don't have 24-hour crews, but we do have on-call staff. And outage management system. This is using, you know, a computerized system to be able to monitor and maybe even control some of the system components. And then survivability. What do we do when everything goes out? So we have, you know, having station batteries to keep electronics up at the substations. COBUG, so this is it's a gas generator. We have 4 natural gas generators that can provide about 5 megawatts of power. That's good for when the system is going through like a brownout. If there's, you know, when we get the call from the system operator, like, hey, the system's really overloaded, can you reduce your usage, your demand on the electric system? We can fire up the COBUG in that case and kind of like shave off our demand from the outside system by up to 5 megawatts. Unfortunately, look at 2 things on that. One, it is natural gas. So if we had like a major earthquake and the gas pipelines were shut down, it's not going to run. Diesel is what we need. We need diesel generators with power source on site, stored on site. It also can't run off-grid the way it's set up at the moment. So if the grid actually does go down, like when we had the airplane, we couldn't get this to act like a little microgrid and run individually off-grid. And then, of course, there's all our communications efforts. We really do try and communicate, and can see how many people came. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Ken. Thank you to everyone who kind of reached out on this. Backups, I think we've gone through here, battery backups. And then, it goes back to community. So I think when we were doing our strategic planning, one of the things about resilience that we heard was we need communication from you. We need to know what to expect, and we need to know what the community is expected to do. How long could we be without electricity? Probably more critically, how long could we be without water supply? And with that, we finished with our presentation. So do you want to do some questions first?
Yeah, let's do some questions. Hector, could we have a light for a few minutes? So, all the way in the back, let's see if we have our extra handheld. Oh, here we go.
And we have one here as well.
So the gentleman all the way in the back, could we get him a microphone? And Ken and Carla, and why don't you come sit here so folks can hear you and see you? You're on the hot seat now.
Thank you. A couple of things. So Ken mentioned the issue of if you have photovoltaics, when the grid goes down, you don't have power. So
You've got
actually,
battery.
what?
Unless you're like you, Arthur, and you've got batteries, of course.
That's right. I have batteries. I do. So the question is, why don't utilities do bulk orders? We actually have done bulk orders for electric cars in terms of promoting things like that. Why don't we do a bulk order kind of system for battery backups? After all, Tesla's in Palo Alto. Why don't we do bulk orders on a block by block basis for bolting foundation of your house to your foundation? That's the most likely thing in an earthquake is your house slides off your foundation, hundreds of thousands of dollars of expense. Bolting it down costs a few $1,000s, a good way to save money. How about 55-gallon food-grade drums to store water in? Bulk order. I actually did that for my neighborhood a few years ago, although I now need a bulk order of people to empty them out and refill them. We have tidal flooding problems. And the liquefaction, it's interesting, there's a co-location of the liquefaction area. If you're in a flood zone, you're in a liquefaction area. Simple as that. But there's certainly been flooding from the San Francisco Creek and important work going on there and trying to fix that. There's actually work going on in terms of the San Francisco, in terms of tidal flooding, with the partly due to people like me. We got the San Francisco Creek Joint Powers Authority having a Safer Bay project. And we're a little bit behind in terms of our study on the Safer Bay project, but that's supposed to deal with tidal flooding. And actually, one of my other hats is I'm vice chair of the Environmental and Water Resources Committee for the Santa Clara Valley Water District. The Water District has put up $12 million plus to pay for tidal flooding infrastructure to deal with that risk. So we need to get that money before it goes to San Jose to deal with some flood protection issues there. So those are kind of things. In terms of the recycled water, people have been talking about toilet to tap. San Jose is doing something similar, but not doing it that way. San Jose actually extracts, in the South Bay, they extract groundwater and they purify it and drink it, okay? So their recycled water facility doesn't go into their water, doesn't go from the water treatment plant into their tap pipeline. It is pumped into the ground, where the ground operates as a giant filter. And thereby, when they extract water from the ground, instead of getting subsidence, it comes instead, water is put in from the recycled water plant, it gets filtered in the ground, and they extract it that way. So we could do things like that.
So let me just interrupt you. I think these are incredible, these solutions, but as we said, we're trying to get a better understanding of all of us, and I love what you're saying. do you have a question for the city? Because I think we're going to continue this conversation to go on into the solutions. And so I hope you will give us some of those, because we'll include those in those comment cards. And in fact, everyone has comment sheets in green on your table. But is there a question you want to ask the city specifically on?
Yeah. So one of the things is that we do have a dig once plan with the city. So we try, when we dig up the streets, we're supposed to do all the utilities at once, so we don't dig them up. Are we also putting in purple piping so that we can expand our recycled water system? Are we also putting in piping for fiber optics so that we can put more the utilities underground at the same time?
Okay, let's ask that question.
No is the answer. No, we're not putting in purple pipe yet. We don't have an approved project, and yeah, no, we don't.
And I think these are sort of the conversations we'll be having over the coming months as we think about priorities and where, I mean, Debbie talked about all these different things in the city that we're doing. Where do we put our energy, our resources? What's the most critical thing as we go through this? So lots to consider. Yeah.
I had a question about water for Carla. I was curious whether we have backup generators to allow us to pump water out of the wells that have been either refurbished or new. And also, I know we did the El Camino storage project. So how many hours of water supply do we think we have once Hetch Hetchy goes down?
So to your first question, my understanding is we only have one permanent pump at El Camino. Oh, we have two that are permanently on wells? Oh, see, I'm wrong already. The other wells, you would need to take a potable or portable generator around to run those other wells. There's also, Ramel, you can answer that. Thank you.
Okay. Hold on one second. Let's hear it so we can all hear you. Catherine has a mic for you.
We have 3 standby portable generators that could be wheeled to any of our facilities. And we have 2 permanently mounted generators, one at El Camino Park and one at the Mayfield Pump Station. The Mayfield Pump Station is primarily a conveyance system that conveys water from the Mayfield Reservoir to our pressure zone 2. But the main focus is, we have standby generators, 3 currently, that could be wheeled to any of the water facilities.
Great, thank you. So
And Ramel, there was a second part of that question,
sorry.
too. Ramel, as far as we have quite a bit of capacity in our 8 wells, plus we have quite a bit of storage up in the hills and at El Camino Park. So I think the answer is we could go for quite a while on local groundwater supply if we needed to.
If we have power.
As long as we have power.
We could sustain water throughout the city if we curtail our demands. I mean, limit it to non-essential use, but just drinking, and we could go on indefinitely.
Yeah.
We are that's correct. We have the capability of producing about 9 million gallons per day.
Yeah. Assuming that we
from our
have
wells.
the power to run the pumps. That's the
yes.
limiting factor.
Sure.
Yes.
Well,
That is correct, and it's a matter of creating an agreement possibly with our fuel stations throughout the city, that we have first dibs to the water pump facilities, and we could essentially sustain it that way.
If they don't have power, they can't pump diesel. So that agreement is not currently in play?
Not that I'm aware of.
So fuel reserves as part of the contingency need to be addressed.
So that sounds like a priority we're going to start talking about as we go forward. Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to move on to this other gentleman here who has a
Thank
question.
you. My first request is, could the City of Palo Alto Utilities provide a rebate for Tesla wall packs or batteries? So when you get the solar system, I don't currently believe they have a rebate or any kind of financial assistance for that, but that would really help the resilience if you were to make your home essentially be able to operate offline, because not only would it help you, but it would help your neighbors after an earthquake. So that's my first request. The second one is, maybe it's a little bit more targeted at Ken, but I know in LA they passed an ordinance saying that they want to have longer term power for the cell tower, so it's not just 2 hours. That would be huge, and I think that's a fairly low hanging fruit. Like maybe on the public safety building, we could put up a cell tower with long term power for that.
Great. Other questions? Okay, so we're going to go, let's see, we'll have, oh, sorry. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Hi, it's very impressive what you've done. Thank you very much. Ken, are you concerned about the people who really don't? It's really about people in the end, right? We need people to make these things happen. So are you concerned that we're so far dispersed, the people who really make things happen in Palo Alto? And should that be linked to the plan, comprehensive plan, that people can actually live here who we need?
Yeah, that it does come down to people. I mean, I can have all the fancy equipment, and so can utilities. If you don't have anybody there to turn the wrench or extinguish the fire, whatever the task is, we failed as a community to plan. It's something that we've drifted away from. I'm one of your only public safety officers who lives in town, and that's a simple reality. I grew up here, it's my hometown, but for the most part, your key staff in utilities, public works, public safety, don't live anywhere near here, as Debbie said, right? You're planning, the best you could hope for is, hey, they're within roughly 30 miles, and that's a on-call crew. Well, that works great as long as the earthquake didn't happen, because 30 miles is an awful long trek with no bridges, and you're walking in. So you're correct. I think, there are a lot of regional planners that have been trying to crack the nut, ABAG and others. We are not the only city in the peninsula that has this challenge. We in public safety do not have the solution, but we'd sure love to have a dialogue with those who are pondering ways to solve it. Thank you.
And I think, so I think that's great. Thank you, guys. We're going to move on to our next piece, which I think is, we've started, I think our brains are all moving along right now and thinking about sort of the magnitude of this. And just in case your brains aren't there yet, we're going to play a video now that is focused on what would happen at a 7.0 earthquake. And we're going to use this scenario to fuel the exercise coming up, which is how do we start to look at all these different elements here in Palo Alto, from people, our built environment, the economy, our houses, hospitals, critical services. How do we start balancing those? And an earthquake, as Ken has said, shows everything that might happen in any of these different scenarios. And so it's a really good one to start with. So hopefully we'll have all the sound. All right. This video was developed with ABAG. Oh, here we go.
One of the most urbanized and dangerous faults in the United States. Millions of people live, work, and travel near the fault each day. There's a large earthquake on the Hayward Fault about every 100 to 220 years. The last one was 150 years ago. It's coming. And when the Hayward Fault ruptures, the roads, the pipes, the wires, the things that connect everyone to people and places will go haywire. The USGS and its partners have created a comprehensive, detailed analysis based on the latest science. A scenario depicting what might happen in a magnitude 7.0 earthquake on the Hayward Fault, before it happens. This gives us a chance to envision our vulnerabilities and a chance to prepare. This new scenario is set on April 18th, 2018, the anniversary of the 1906 Great San Francisco earthquake and fire. The following scenario explores the possibility of a Hayward Fault earthquake. It is not a prediction, and a real earthquake on the Hayward Fault could occur at any time and may behave quite differently. April 18th, 2018, 4:18 p.m. The earthquake begins. With an epicenter at Oakland, the rupture races 52 miles along the fault towards Fremont and Richmond at speeds of 7,000 miles per hour. In Berkeley and Hayward, the ground shifts 3 to 5 feet, ripping through buried pipes and wires. The USGS shake map shows areas of violent and extreme shaking, lasting up to 30 seconds or longer, causing very heavy damage. Away from the epicenter, a warning arrives up to 25 seconds before strong shaking begins. Impacts and destruction are magnified by a cascade of hazards. In the haywired scenario, 800 people die and 18,000 more are injured. 2,500 people need to be rescued from collapsed buildings, while another 22,000 are trapped in elevators. In this scenario, 77,000 to 152,000 households could be displaced. Some East Bay residents lose water for 6 weeks and up to 6 months in the worst hit areas. Lack of firefighting water could turn some of the more than 400 fires into conflagrations, burning the equivalent of 52,000 single-family homes. Who has power, water, gas, and communications? Every lifeline is disrupted to some extent. This could be the first major U.S. earthquake in the age of the internet. What happens in a disconnected world? Dozens of significant aftershocks and fault afterslip will cause additional costly damage, requiring repeated inspections and repairs. Property damage and direct business losses exceed $82 billion, mostly due to shaking, but also to liquefaction and landslides. Fires could cause hundreds more fatalities and an additional $30 billion damage, and would extend the duration of disruption. Few things are insured. How many people will move away? What will such a disaster mean to you, your family, and your community? Acting now can save lives and jobs, businesses, neighborhoods, and homes. The Bay Area has invested over $50 billion since the 1989 Loma Prieta quake, strengthening potential points of failure, infrastructure, and buildings. But these efforts need to continue and expand through your engagement. Use the haywired scenario. Doing so will reveal actions that will lessen business disruption and improve our ability to bounce back. More actions like these will reduce risk, and creation of the haywired scenario offers you an opportunity to do your part. Partners are continuing to come together to share interdependencies, resources, and solutions. Use the science. Come together, because together we can outsmart disaster.
All right, thank you. So let that settle in a little bit. I think that this scenario obviously is not that crazy. We all have seen an earthquake. And so what we're going to do today is talk more about what an earthquake might mean to Palo Alto, to the Palo Alto utilities. Let's see, can we get the screen raised and turn this off? Okay, great. So before we're gonna have a break in just a minute, but before we do, I want to just spend a few minutes as we're sort of absorbing all this information to ask all of you, what do you think resilience means to you, to as Palo Alto? We've heard a lot from our experts, from our staff, and now I'm curious from the city and the community, what does that mean to you? And I'm going to write some of this up on this board, and we're going to start thinking about that. And so this will, hopefully take us into our exercise. So does anybody want to sort of say to them, what resilience might mean to you? Yeah. Yeah, can you be self-sufficient? Uh-huh. Anybody else have something? The gentleman in the striped shirt. Your home safe. Next. I would say that's maybe asking the hard questions, maybe, you know, that really are kind of diving into this, not just checking a box, but we're really deeply planning. Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Got it. Okay. Let's see. Let's see. The woman right here, and then we'll go here. Great. Yeah. Be able to shelter at home. Yeah. Stay in your neighborhoods. We don't all want to leave.
I'd like to see a community survivability focus, not every man for himself.
Yeah, coming together. And you know, I think one of the things that Ken brought up is this idea that if our emergency services aren't here in town, how do we, and it goes to this idea of the self-sufficient family, but maybe it's also community self-sufficient at the same time. Let's see, all the way in the back.
Yeah, just related to that, social equity. So people of all income levels have access to resources and that it isn't just resources get.
Well, and that's, you know, one of the challenges, and we know in disasters and problems that those communities are often the ones who are most hardest hit and don't have the redundancy in their own community to deal with that. Yes, right here.
And functional afterwards.
I'm sorry, can you repeat?
Oh, our schools are safe and functional afterwards.
Schools. I heard schools are safe. I hear functional?
Functional afterwards.
Okay. Yeah.
Streets and arterials are clear, so if there are supplies, I can get to them.
Right. Now let me ask something clear. So these are, I mean, we just saw this big disaster, but what about after? You know, how do we as a community, I like this idea of community self-sufficiency. We're investing money, we're investing time in our people. What does that mean after the fact? And what does the idea of resilience mean to you? I don't know if that adds a little bit of a nuance. Some people say it's just being able to bounce back. Is that the idea that we're trying to create a utility that's bouncing back? Does that resonate with you? Yes, Judith.
So to me, are there reasonable investments that we can make as a city that will allow, I'm less concerned about the major earthquake that destroys the entire region as I am about the kinds of things that could happen on a regular basis and a reasonable expectation. Are there things we can do so that we don't either fall apart, or if something happens that we can then bounce back quickly within hours or days rather than weeks or months because we didn't think ahead?
Mm-hmm. Right. Great. Yeah.
So you heard something that I didn't say. I said community survivability, and you wrote self-sufficiency, and those are really different. Survivability could be joint action plans and coordinated with other communities. Could be all sorts of things. It's not self-sufficiency.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you. So when you say survivability, is that you're thinking about life?
I'm thinking about the community.
Mm-hmm.
Communities, meaning that we are continuing to work together to build and recover Palo Alto, and that was really in response to and it comes with the social equity. We can approach this ourselves as individuals who have means to survive ourselves, or to have the helicopter or the drone that takes us out to a safe place. But it's the community that we want to be resilient about.
Right, right. Yeah, it's no good if you have just your house on an island. I know from the big earthquake, or the big fire in the East Bay, houses that were survived but surrounded by complete destruction, that didn't feel like a community. And so that idea of surviving together, I think maybe is what more you're getting at. Yeah, great. Anybody else want to add anything to this? Yes.
I think to that point is sort of the community coming together. There has to be a sense of organization, that people will volunteer. There's some sort of a leadership, that people will take certain roles, and members of the community sort of will look towards that sort of leadership. There is some sort of a collective plan versus an ad hoc individual sort of actions, because it takes some time for people sort of to get self-organized, right? So you want to be self-sufficient and organized in that sense.
Right.
Right. And obviously you need communications, so people to be able to communicate with each other and have access to information, whether through radio stations or whatnot, so they can actually self-organize.
Right. So communications is sort of out of the city, but also internally, right? And that's definitely part of the utilities goal. Let's see if we have those two folks right there.
Google has been experimenting with cell site or internet access via aerial drones and things of that sort. And what I would propose is that auxiliary communication infrastructure in partnership with Google is put in place such that when we need communications infrastructure, that the cell sites go into the air, which is to say we become a testing ground for that technology in partnership with a technology firm.
Yeah.
The other thing, of course, is keeping everybody's cell phone charged, which means that cell phone charging stations, driven probably by lithium-ion batteries, maybe generators, should be allocated such that everybody can keep their cell phone online. So between those two, we get the communication infrastructure that allows the community to remain a community and plan how it can recover.
That's great. Let's have one more comment, and then we're going to move on to our break. Yes.
For me, resilience means, do neighbors know each other? Is there systems in place like Transition US where, you know, neighbors know one another and can create networks and plug into community resources like Certified Emergency Response Team networks? Basically, do people know each other in such a way that they can spring up with the decentralized hubs that are, as we've seen in the North Bay fires, are necessary when our everyday communication systems aren't available?
Great.
Thank you.
So I think that's a really great starting point, and we're going to continue this in our small groups, but I just want us to hear from each other. I think this idea of community clearly is what's resonating so far tonight. And what we want to do after our break is come back, and you're going to have a little packet at each of your tables. And we're going to have some tables that are going to focus on the people question, some that are built on around the economy, some that are on the natural environment, critical services, and then the built environment, our homes and schools and so forth. And you're going to look at a scenario that will be provided to you that's kind of like the earthquake, but it's a Palo Alto specific earthquake. And then among your table, you're going to talk about what are the priorities that you as Palo Altans want the utility to start focusing on. And I know this is a little hard to separate the idea of the Palo Alto, everything you want to do versus what the utility wants to do. But if you can, we're really trying to hopefully give some direction and focus to the utility as they go forward for those investments. So that's what we're going to talk about, and we'll talk a little bit more. We'll have a table facilitator at each table. We may move some of you guys around, and folks who are on the outside will have to come to a table. But let's take a quick break. There's great food in the back. The bathrooms are just right out this door. And so let's take about 20 after. Come on back. And we're going to start promptly. Yeah, and if you were a table facilitator, why don't you come on up here so we can chat with you. Uh, Okay, folks. Let's start finding a table. Please spread yourselves out. Grab your snacks and let's find a seat. You'll see on each table there's a highlighted word in the middle that is going to be what you're talking about. Benson, if you want to join any of the group, feel free. And we Thank you. You're very awesome. All right, so let's sit down, folks. And if you're finding that you don't have anybody in yours, I do. Okay, you have people. Okay, great. We have some space over here talking about the economy. Come on over, sit on down, pull up a chair. So we're going to get started again. I won't do the school teacher, clap back at me. All right, so at each of your tables, you should have a facilitator. Let's see, do we have our facilitator at this table? Can you raise your hand if you're a facilitator? I need a facilitator here. Where's my facilitators? Can I have an extra facilitator over here? All right, great, Carla. So your facilitator is going to lead you through this exercise. The hope here is that all of you spend some time listening to one another, thinking about this, and then sharing your ideas about your values, the goals for the city, and specifically the utility, and hopefully coming up with some priorities. We're not solution setting here. We're not going to try and set solutions. I know it's hard. Try not to solve things. But what are our priorities? Where do we want to focus? What is our goal for the future? All right. Thank you very much, and enjoy your conversation. Okay, I know it's not a lot of time, but let's start talking about your priorities and identifying your 3 key priorities. Okay, like 2 more minutes, everybody, 2 minutes. Okay, I know you guys could keep on talking, but since Since we don't want to be here all night, we're going to wrap it up and listen to each other for a few minutes across the board. Sorry. So what I'd like us to do is have each group, and I just gave some people some microphones so they can, because I think we're recording this and we want people to hear you. So if you could have somebody in your group who will volunteer to report out what you talked about in your 3 priorities, that would be great. And I maybe start here up in front. Is it on? Make sure that's on there. And I'm going to try and record what people are saying here. So it has to be green. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Tell us what your asset was and what are the things you discovered or thought about.
Okay. Esther. Our thing was critical services. And so we identified what we thought were the top 3 critical services. And specifically, we defined it as continuity of vital services. So, for example, when we talk about electricity, which is number 1, it's not electricity to turn on the TV. It's electricity for the water pumps, for the 911 system, for police and fire, for communication. And it sort of goes down in a hierarchy, obviously for the hospital, etc. Number 2 is water. And again, there's that same set of priorities. Fire suppression would actually be ahead of drinking water, then drinking water, and of course other things like the hospital, etc. And then thirdly is communication, and providing continuity of service for that, for the emergency responders, and then for people to communicate with each other, to link up and do that kind of stuff.
Would it be safe to say that what you're trying to talk about is sort of a framework that's like a hierarchy of kind of the critical things that we need to do to like just keep on moving? Is that appropriate?
Yeah, that's exactly what.
Okay, great, awesome. So just to keep continuity and the same area, where's my other critical services table? Okay, so that's great. So let's go on to, how about right here? The economy.
Testing? Okay. So this was challenging because, of course, certainly my thoughts and the table members were, focused on, oh my gosh, we don't have water, we don't have electricity, and now you want me to talk about the economy? But we did identify some pretty high priority retail to help the community get back in operation quickly. Obviously the hardware stores for building supplies, gas stations, grocery stores, pharmacies, big box retail. These are all places that are gonna need to get open quickly so the community can get repaired and restored. And so how will we know which of these are going to be open? And is there any, organization or way that the city or the Chamber of Commerce can help, help these guys get back open, both in as far as electricity and water, but also their employees. If the Dumbarton's down, where will they have enough employees to open? And do they even have transfer switches to hook up like a backup generator while the electricity is out? And so could the utilities facilitate some transfer switch or generation or even just refueling, getting the refueling contracts for high priority assets? And then we thought for the offices and R&D, the headquarters, the premier, tenants that we have here in Palo Alto, that they probably will be able to get their employees to work remotely and with the cloud, but of course that requires data centers remotely that are connected and getting Palo Alto internet exchange. So be sure that if it's true that, that the internet will break if Palo Alto goes down, of course the global economy could be affected, but I have faith that there's some redundancy there, but might be good to just check in on that. And then lastly, schools need to be in service for employees to get back to work. And so we have to think about, all of the steps. Where are the people going to come from? And are there, get their kids in daycare? Is that set up so that they can get back to work? So those are some of our thoughts on the economy.
Excellent. Yeah, did you have a question?
did the economy group think about money and what people are gonna, because all I carry is $20 in my wallet and a bunch of credit cards. Credit cards aren't gonna work. Did the economy group think about what I'm gonna use to buy things at the retail store?
Good question. I'm going to add that up here. That's a good one.
What can you barter?
All right. Well, and I think that's an excellent question. I'm going to say, though, from a utility perspective, there's going to be concerns about that, but that's, I mean, it is an important one, but I don't know how the utilities' role in managing that. I have noted it up here that we have to do that. The question is, how does the utility play in that, and what is the impact for the utilities' perspective? So, right, yep. Right, because they have workers, yeah. And as you see, I have a whole category here with the utilities roles here. So let me go to the next group because we don't have that much time. So I'm going to move us along to, let's see, Catherine, do you want to go ahead?
So our team was focusing on the natural environment. And so we were considering the fact that depending upon the season, we could have different impacts. If it's the dry summer season, we could have the incidence of fire in the natural environment. So the foothills, of course, are the obvious culprit, but we've got a lot of a wildland-urban interface around the city. Conversely, if it's the wet winter season, we could have the potential for flooding. What if this occurs, of course, during the perfect storm time period where we have king tide coming in, and we have rain coming down from the foothills, flooding the valleys, filling up our sewer system, and of course, Ken's giving me the thumbs up because we like to think about the perfect storm when it comes to emergency preparedness, right? Why don't we just throw in a Super Bowl at the same time, too? So
Niners in the Super Bowl? No.
So potential flooding. Of course, in thinking about the natural environment, we're thinking about what's going to be the impacts to the creeks, of course, debris that is blocking the creeks that could exacerbate that, fallen trees, landslides. We could even have wildlife coming in from the foothills or even the baylands. And how do we deal with mountain lions and coyotes and whatnot? Parks, it's a natural environment. They could become a gathering place for people to camp if they are displaced from their homes. So how do we think about making that a safe area and provide the necessary health and safety utility resources that people camping out would need to survive? And then we even went as far as the doomsday scenario that there's the potential diseases, or the potential for diseases to spread, and parks may become a place for quarantining people. Of course, that's moving over into the the areas that utilities doesn't have direct control over, but these are all potential impacts.
Great. All right, so let's see. Let's go all the way to the back. Catherine, if you could share your mic with the table next to you, or there we go. Debbie's got that. Great.
Okay, we are addressing people resources. And we first were thinking that we should be planning housing so that emergency responders and other like medical responders would still be in the city. So we should be establishing worker housing. And that could look like affordable housing just for workers. It can be even, as Judith here was saying, a few rooms in a hotel put aside just for workers. We also discussed ways to make sure city workers are somehow integrated with the community, so we have some idea who these people are and what resources are available. And we should be tracking care facilities and our at-risk residents. Like right behind us is Stevenson House, which has about 140 seniors, some of whom are mobility impaired. And we want to encourage participation in CERT. Anyone a CERT trained person? Yeah, Marna too. That's community emergency response training. And adding to that, we might resurrect Panda. Did anyone ever take part in Panda? Yeah, Palo Alto neighborhood disaster activities. And we should be establishing resource maps of resources available after a disaster, including, if we have them established, resilience hubs. And overall, we should just be cultivating neighborhood relationships and networks, because
Great.
that's who's going to be available to us when a disaster strikes.
That's right.
Great. All right, let's just continue around to the back right here.
We also dealt with housing. We also
People,
talked.
you mean?
With people.
Okay, good.
And we also dealt with housing in terms of people. We identified the workforce housing at the VTA lot. Why not allocate that to our utilities and city staff as opposed to people working for Palantir or Facebook? We talked about the issues of staff retention, and particularly experienced staff retention and recruitment as being an issue. We also talked about the idea that we have emergency service volunteers who are essentially doing part of the job of fire people and part of the job of police in some sense, but we don't have an idea of utility service volunteers. And there are a lot of electrical engineers and contractors and people like that with the right skills who could be trained on how our utility equipment works and could fill in the event of an emergency. So when our utilities workers aren't available, we can fill in that locally. We focused mainly on utility workers. We did think also about the issue that the people living here, especially those with special needs, elderly, disabled, kids, small kids, things like that, where there's needs there, and wanting the neighborhood leaders, the neighborhoods where there's organized neighborhoods, to gather information on that. Don't put it on a computer file because you won't have access to computer, but actually have paper files where people can go around and make sure that everybody is safe and has the resources that they need.
Excellent, great. And let's say perfect.
Okay, so we had the built environment, and the first thing we wanted to look at was investment in fault detection to minimize and mitigate the damage, and that would be isolating not just electrical with circuit breakers, but maybe looking at gas and water to avoid loss of water, for example. Identify locations that could be turned into community services for shelter and other needs for displaced residents, looking at the schools, community centers, places like the Elks, and looking at what the legal requirements might be in terms of ordinances to allow us to gain access to facilities, hotels, for example. And then the last thing was understanding what the building code and code enforcement might be, and are there any unintended consequences of building codes? For example, now that we require sprinkling in houses, could we deplete our entire reservoir of water when all the sprinklers went off and then not have any left?
Good question. Okay, that's excellent. Great. Let's go right here in the center. Yeah.
Okay, our group handled the natural environment, and from a utility standpoint, the top 3 utilities that we're looking at in preserving the natural environment, which entails natural infrastructure such as creeks, the wildlife and park and rec areas. We looked at preserving and protecting our water supply. Next is communication, and lastly, electricity, or providing power, so that we could pretty much power up the facilities to protect the natural environment.
It's kind of interesting. It's very similar in some ways to what the critical services group did, which is this idea of creating some hierarchies, but managing that natural environment so you get the benefit out of that. So it seems like there's some alignment going on here. I love it.
Absolutely.
That's great.
Thank
Okay,
you.
let's see. Right here, Robert.
Great. Okay, I think it is on. Okay, so we took as our mantra the expression
And
we had
what
up
group
there.
are you?
We're built environment.
Okay, great.
So we took as the mantra we came up with before that it was important to survive as a community. So with that as our guidance, the first thing we talked about was making sure that houses were safe and buildings were safe, under the idea that you can't help someone else until you have your own, put on your own mask before you help someone else. So really focusing on making sure the houses were bolted to their foundations and buildings were safe so that people had a place to go and if there was a disaster. So that was a key focus, we thought. We also wanted to make sure our schools and churches were safe. A lot of us have talked about, I think the team over here talked about resilience hubs. We talked about depots. How could we use the schools as a place people could go get resources? We talked a lot about having water, but how do we know that the pipes are going to work? So knowing that people could go to their local school for power, potentially for food, for water, could be really helpful. And then our third area was water supply and distribution, making sure that that was secure. And then again, through a process, whether it came out of the pipes or it came through bottles or other facilities, getting that to people.
That's great. And there seems like there's a little trend going on, which is the idea of hubs, community hubs of some sort, where we can, and I think you just said it, like there's a place where we have kind of built-in resilience and creating pipes that work, power that work. So that idea of it's maybe not every single thing, but we have some selected places that can really support us as a community. That's one of the themes that might be coming out here. Let's see, did we get all our tables? Great, perfect. So let me ask, does anybody now, we have a few minutes left, that I'd like to sort of open it up for a few more comments and thoughts. And particularly, I think we have a lot of interesting pieces here, but are there specific roles you see the utility filling? So I'm going to kind of focus us here. Like, do we think there's a role that the utilities can do to support us in achieving some of this? Yes, right here. I have this gentleman here and then back here.
We need a road.
Hold on, let me just get you that.
We need a roadmap to a smart grid. And when I say that, I'm not just talking about the electrical grid, I'm also talking about gas distribution and water distribution. All of them need to be intelligent enough that they can be fault managed. This is not something that we should neglect till next year. There should be a roadmap as to how we make our distribution grids intelligent enough that when there are faults in them, we can contain those faults, whether it's flooding or gas fires or electrical arcing. All of these things we can mitigate half of the catastrophe if we just make the utility grid smart enough and secure enough that hackers don't get in. That's obvious. Okay, so if we have secure smart grids and we manage the water to the sprinklers in the buildings, in other words, one of the things that's mentioned is we don't want to flow all our water away because the sprinklers are going off. We should make intelligent decisions as to where the sprinklers go off. And that can be done, again, with data infrastructure. So smart grids for everything, including fire control in the sprinklers.
Great. This gentleman right up here, and then we'll go back to you.
We've been talking about things going in, but we haven't talked about things going out. And for safety, public safety, waste disposal is a necessary element to be considered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that in Santa Barbara, after the fires and the floods, 100-year events within 2 weeks of each other. One of the hugest things they're still grappling with is how do they get rid of all the contaminated mud and ash. It's a huge issue. And in terms of resilience, so it's not just managing the disaster at that moment, it's how do you create your community back? How do you support a viable, strong community? And so I think that is a really important one to think about, and where does the utility fit into that? I'm not sure exactly, but I think that's an important thing to consider. Back here, and then we'll come over here.
Looking at the liquefaction map, there was an amazing coincidence that a lot of the utilities infrastructure, including the utilities engineering over on Elwell Court, the Municipal Services Center, the Regional Water Quality Control Plant, otherwise known as our sewage treatment plant, are all in the liquefaction zone on the other side of 101. If the bridges are impassable over 101, if they liquefy, if the grid goes out, we've got a problem. And so the first thing about putting on your mask yourself before you put the mask on, the oxygen mask on everybody else, we need to make sure that our infrastructure for utilities is secure. And maybe that means taking the utility infrastructure, the utilities engineering, and putting it somewhere on this side of the bay. I mean, on this side of 101. Maybe we can find space in the public service building, that building, so that one has a continuous power and things like that. Maybe it doesn't belong on the other side of 101.
Good point. Thank you. This lady right here in the back, in green.
The gentleman behind me also has something.
I can't see him behind the pad.
Would you like to go, sir?
Go ahead, you already started.
I think a role utilities could play is to preempt what the probable resilience hubs and resource points will be, and to start to create some kind of decentralized operations possibilities for those places in advance, so they're not trying to create those opportunities post hoc. It will be harder. And then also to maybe fund or support in some meaningful way an outreach, so that the living systems of, things like CERT or PANDA or, networks of people knowing and supporting one another have some juice and sexiness behind them.
Great, that's awesome. And I think those are, I think some of this was with OES and they're doing some of that, but I think there's a real value in this collaboration and cooperation that can happen there. Yes, and I think you might be our last word.
Okay.
Oh, okay, so you're gonna be our last word. Yours your second to last word.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Idea is to have all the citizens that want to volunteer, they have like engineering skills and things, go online and say they're available in emergency and what their skills are. And then go to all the neighborhood groups or the neighborhood hub if we ever get one, and they could pick the ones in their cities. And then also centrally, like, so you could have your cars feed the neighborhood, but you can coordinate with all the other neighborhoods so you could get it to where it's needed. And then the other idea I had was when the power goes off, when it comes back on, everybody still has their air conditioner on and their hot tubs and everything. Everybody should have a list of what to turn off, so when it comes back on, you don't drain it and then all the circuit breakers pop again and they have to start all over again.
Great. That's really helpful because, people are always wondering, what do I do? What do I do? And, it was interesting in Sonoma when the first fire happened in 2017, a lot of people were trying to figure out, what do I do? Who do I trust? What is the information to get me to that next place? And so creating clear information channels about that, I think, is a really important one, and that could be a role. Yeah, and then gentleman right here. Yeah.
Yeah, so following up on this woman's idea here, the role should be supporting microgrids around schools, churches, community centers, such that we have this distributed, resilient centers around the city where people can congregate and get information, and that will be their resource there that is will still have power and communications.
Yeah, and so that's the idea, that we're not trying to have the entire city of Palo Alto, this giant island and microgrid, but you're very selective that you're serving the community through clear hubs. So I think that, again, that idea of hubs and creating microgrids at those hubs that have volunteers that are, you know, have all these elements to them might be it's a kind of an overwhelming strategy I'm hearing. So
Correct, and the microgrids could be as small as one person's off-grid or battery backed up home, which might power the cell tower that's right next to them, for instance, something like that.
Yeah.
So combination of.
Fantastic. So you guys have been incredible, and I want to really thank the staff who put so much time and energy, not just today for this workshop, but for everything else. You know, they've done an incredible job here. And I really hope that we're going to have the next workshop. I'm not sure if it's in the next couple months, but then we're going to try and take some of the stuff you have here and start to say, okay, what do these cost? What do they look like? And then how do we start to create that roadmap so we can create a more resilient utility? And that's going to come out soon. Let's see, is anybody else, Ed, do you want to say anything else on next steps and final words here?
Well, yeah, just in terms of some of the logistics, we'll feed this back. We will feed this back. Again, this is a Utility Advisory Commission initiative, and feed it back to the UAC at its next meeting, or as soon as we can pull the write-up together so that the UAC can then digest and then give us some direction on where to go next. You know, by design, much of the setup here has been focused on a singular disaster as a way to kind of focus some of the discussion, but I really appreciate how much of the feedback has then